The day the land became mine did not arrive with celebration or clarity, and it certainly did not feel like a gift at first. It came quietly, wrapped in legal language, and delivered through a phone call that interrupted an otherwise ordinary afternoon, a call that informed me that a distant relative I barely knew had passed away and left behind something so large it felt unreal on first hearing. 1,200 acres of land, spread across rolling hills, wooded sections, old access roads, forgotten fences, and boundary lines that had not been seriously questioned in decades. And as the words settled in my mind, they carried with them not excitement but weight, because land of that size is not just property. It is responsibility, history, and conflict waiting to surface, even if you do not yet know from where. I remember driving out to see it for the first time, the road narrowing as the city disappeared behind me, the landscape opening into wide stretches of earth that seemed untouched by modern urgency, and I felt something close to peace as I stood there, looking across land that had belonged to my family long before subdivisions, HOAs, and color-coded compliance notices ever existed, a place where the wind moved freely and the ground did not answer to committees. At that moment, nothing seemed complicated, and the idea that anyone would challenge ownership felt absurd, because the paperwork was clean. The deed was recorded, and the land had a history older than most of the nearby developments. For a brief time, I believed that inheriting land meant inheriting freedom. That belief did not last long. Within weeks, subtle signs began appearing that someone else believed they had a say in what happened on that land, small indications at first, like official-looking envelopes arriving in my mailbox with unfamiliar logos and overly formal language. Letters that reference community standards, maintenance expectations, and compliance reviews, all written as if the sender assumed authority without ever explaining where it came from. I initially dismissed them as mistakes, assuming some database error had lumped my acreage into a nearby residential association by accident, and I set them aside unopened, focusing instead on surveying the land, walking boundaries, and imagining what could be done with it in the future. That calm routine ended the morning a certified letter arrived, heavier than the others, marked urgent, and addressed to me by name, which made ignoring it impossible. The letter did not ask questions or request clarification. It informed me, with confidence bordering on arrogance, that my property fell under the jurisdiction of a homeowners association, formed years after the land had been parceled, and that I was now expected to comply with their regulations, pay accumulated dues, and submit development plans for approval. The language was carefully crafted to sound final, as if the matter had already been decided, and reading it felt like someone trying to rewrite reality with stationery and bold fonts. Confusion gave way to irritation, because the land was not part of any subdivision, had never been marketed as such, and had remained intact through decades of zoning changes. And yet here was an organization claiming oversight, as though they had always been there. I began researching the association, learning its name, its board members, its reach, and its reputation, and what I found was troubling in a quiet, procedural way. This was not a small, neighborly group enforcing lawn height rules, but a well-funded HOA with a history of aggressive expansion, one that had slowly grown outward from its original development, absorbing adjacent parcels through pressure, assumption, and legal intimidation, rather than clear authority. Their strategy was subtle, relying on the fact that many landowners did not have the time, money, or patience to challenge them. And as I dug deeper, I realized that the letters were not errors, but opening moves. The realization that an HOA believed it could step onto 1,200 acres of inherited land and declare control felt surreal, yet the tone of their communication suggested they fully expected compliance, as though resistance was not even considered an option. What unsettled me most was how confident they were, how their wording implied that I was late to a system that had already decided my place within it, and that sense of inevitability was clearly intentional, designed to push recipients into acceptance before they questioned the premise. I spent nights rereading the deed, cross-referencing maps, checking county records, and the more I looked, the clearer it became that the land was legally outside their boundaries, never annexed, never subjected to covenants, and never signed over to any association, which made their certainty feel less like a mistake and more like a test of how far they could go. Still, despite that clarity, a creeping unease set in, because organizations that operate this way do not stop at letters, and the calm of standing alone on inherited land began to feel fragile, like the quiet before something disruptive arrives. I did not yet know how aggressive they could be, how far they were willing to push, or how deeply they believed in their own authority. But as I folded the letter back into its envelope, one thing became clear. The land had come with a challenge attached, and the peace I felt standing on those acres was already being tested by people who had never walked them, never owned them, and yet somehow believed they could claim them through pressure alone. The chapter of inheritance had closed and another was opening, one defined not by land itself, but by the fight over who truly had the right to control it, setting the stage for a conflict that would grow louder, more aggressive, and far more personal than I ever expected. The weeks following the first certified letter unfolded with a strange tension that never fully surfaced but never left either, a pressure that sat quietly in the background of everyday tasks, reminding me that something unresolved was watching and waiting, because once an HOA decides it has authority, it rarely retreats on its own, and sure enough the next phase arrived not with questions or clarifications, but with escalation disguised as routine administration. More letters came, each one incrementally firmer than the last, shifting from polite compliance reminders to statements of obligation, attaching dollar amounts to alleged dues that supposedly dated back years before I had ever known the land existed, as if time itself could be retroactively rewritten by a committee vote. The language changed subtly but unmistakably, moving from may be required to is required, from please respond to failure to comply will result. And with every envelope, the assumption hardened that my silence equaled submission, that not immediately challenging their authority meant I accepted it. I began to notice something else as well, something less formal but far more intrusive. Vehicles slowing along the access road, unfamiliar cars parked just long enough to observe, clipboards visible through windshields, people walking the perimeter as though the land were already under review, and that was when irritation turned into something sharper, because observation without permission is a declaration in itself. The land had no gates then, no signs, no reason to expect trespassers, and yet suddenly it felt monitored, like a resource being evaluated rather than property being respected. I responded the only way that made sense at first, by sending copies of the deed, tax records, and boundary maps back to the association, assuming that once confronted with clear documentation, they would correct their records and quietly withdraw, because no reasonable organization would continue asserting control over land it had no legal claim to. That assumption proved naive. The response I received did not address the documents directly. Instead, it reframed the issue entirely, claiming historical inclusion, implied consent through proximity, and a vague concept of community continuity. That suggested authority could exist without signatures, without annexation, without any concrete legal foundation at all. It was an argument built on atmosphere rather than law, and reading it felt like watching someone attempt to push a boundary simply because they believed it would move if pressured long enough. The tone was confident, almost dismissive, as though my documentation was a minor inconvenience rather than definitive proof. And it became clear that this was not a misunderstanding but a calculated approach, one that relied on persistence and intimidation rather than legitimacy. Around this time, the demands expanded beyond paperwork and money, branching into land use restrictions that made no sense for a property of this size, rules written for suburban lots being applied to hundreds of acres of undeveloped terrain, requirements about fencing styles, landscaping standards, and environmental reviews that assumed residential density where none existed. The absurdity of it all would have been almost funny if it were not so aggressive, because each demand carried the implied threat of enforcement, fines, liens, and legal action, all presented as inevitable consequences of noncompliance. I started receiving notices of scheduled inspections, times and dates when representatives would visit the property to assess adherence, notices that did not ask for permission and did not acknowledge that stepping onto the land without consent would itself be trespassing. That was the moment the conflict crossed from paper to physical reality, from something that could be ignored to something that demanded a response, because land disputes become far more dangerous once one side believes it can act first and explain later. I installed cameras at access points, posted clear no trespassing signs, and documented every interaction, every vehicle, every piece of correspondence, understanding instinctively that this situation was heading somewhere that would require evidence rather than arguments. Despite that, the HOA continued as though nothing had changed, sending violation notices for conditions that existed naturally on rural land, tall grasses labeled as neglect, old fences labeled as hazards, and wildlife paths described as unapproved alterations, each citation stacking on. Next, creating a paper trail of supposed noncompliance that they could later point to as justification for stronger action. What unsettled me most was how detached the process felt, how the people issuing these demands clearly had never stood on the land, never understood its scale, history, or function, and yet felt entitled to reshape it according to rules designed for cul-de-sacs, acts, and manicured lawns. This was not governance, it was projection, the assumption that everything nearby must eventually conform to their model, and that resistance was merely a temporary inconvenience to be worn down. As the pressure increased, so did the sense that the HOA was not simply mistaken but emboldened by past success, likely having absorbed smaller parcels before through similar tactics, gradually expanding their reach until their authority felt larger than it truly was. I realized then that this was not about me personally, nor even about the land itself, but about precedent, about whether they could add 1,200 acres to their domain simply by insisting long enough and making the cost of resistance seem unbearable. That realization sharpened my focus, because giving in would not just surrender land, it would validate a strategy that thrived on intimidation, and yet fighting meant preparing for something far more exhausting than a simple disagreement. By the end of that month, the letters had turned into warnings, the warnings into deadlines, and the deadlines into threats of enforcement actions that grew more specific by the day, and standing on the land no longer felt peaceful. It felt contested, like a place quietly being encroached upon by authority that existed only on paper, but was determined to become real through force of will. The first line had been crossed not by a lawsuit or a lien, but by the assumption that resistance would eventually fade, and as I reviewed the growing stack of notices, it became clear that the HOA was not waiting for permission to act. They were waiting for me to give up, setting the stage for confrontation that would soon move beyond letters and inspections into something far more public and far more aggressive, a turning point where ignoring them would no longer be an option and responding would mean choosing how far I was willing to go to defend land that was never theirs to begin with. By the time the third chapter of this conflict began, the HOA had shifted from distant pressure to active presence, moving with a confidence that suggested they believed the outcome was already decided, and that belief alone made their actions bolder and more intrusive with each passing week. The notices no longer arrived sporadically. They came in clusters, carefully timed, layered in a way that felt strategic, as though someone had mapped out an escalation plan designed to overwhelm rather than persuade. And with each envelope I opened, it became clearer that they were constructing a narrative in which my land was already under their control, a narrative they could later point to as established fact. The most troubling development came when I received documentation stating that my property had been placed on an internal compliance watch list, a designation that meant additional inspections, higher scrutiny, and accelerated enforcement timelines, all without a single court order or legal ruling to justify such authority. It was an administrative invention masquerading as power, and yet the consequences were real, because once an organization decides it has jurisdiction, it begins acting, as though consent is irrelevant. I noticed fresh tire tracks along dirt access points that had not been used in years, footprints near boundary markers, and even temporary survey flags appearing overnight, as if someone were quietly mapping the land without acknowledging that mapping itself was an act of trespass. These were not accidents or misunderstandings. They were deliberate steps meant to normalize presence, to make their involvement feel inevitable, and to create the impression that the land was already integrated into their system. I documented everything, logging dates, times, vehicle descriptions, and camera footage, not because I expected immediate relief, but because I understood that conflicts like this are often 1 month later by those who prepare early. When I formally demanded that all HOA representatives cease entering the property without permission, citing trespassing laws and attaching legal references, the response I received was chillingly casual, a brief acknowledgement that avoided addressing the substance of the demand while reiterating their ongoing obligation to inspect and enforce standards across the community, a phrase that quietly reasserted their claim without ever proving it. This was not negotiation, it was assertion through repetition, and repetition has a way of shaping perception even when it lacks legitimacy. Around this time, neighbors from surrounding developments began to take notice, some curious, some wary, and a few openly concerned, because the HOA had started referencing my land in community newsletters and meeting summaries, describing it as an area pending full integration. Language that framed ownership as a temporary technicality rather than settled legal reality. That kind of messaging does not just inform, it conditions, preparing residents to accept expansion as normal and resistance as obstruction. And it became apparent that the HOA was not just pressuring me privately, but laying groundwork publicly, building support for actions they had not yet taken, but clearly intended to. Financial pressure intensified as well, with invoices for back dues arriving alongside late fees, penalties, and interest calculated over years when the land had never been associated with the HOA at all. Numbers that grew large enough to feel intimidating even though they were entirely fabricated. This tactic was familiar once I recognized it, the use of inflated costs to make compliance seem cheaper than resistance, a psychological lever designed to push landowners toward settlement rather than confrontation. What made this phase especially unsettling was how calm the HOA appeared throughout it all, how routine their communications sounded, as though asserting control over land they did not own was simply another administrative task on their agenda, no different from approving paint colors or issuing parking permits. That calmness masked the aggression of their actions, making them harder to confront emotionally while remaining deeply invasive in practice. I began consulting professionals, not to initiate immediate legal action, but to understand the terrain I was entering, and what I learned only reinforced the seriousness of the situation, because while the HOA claims were weak, their persistence could still cause significant disruption through liens, recorded notices, and procedural obstacles that take time and money to unwind even when they are ultimately invalidated. This was their leverage, not legal strength, but endurance, the ability to drag someone through enough friction that victory feels hollow by the time it arrives. The first real shock came when I received notice that a preliminary lien assessment had been prepared, not filed yet, but drafted, ready to be recorded if compliance was not achieved by an arbitrary deadline they had set, a move that transformed abstract threats into something tangible and damaging. A lien, even an improper one, can freeze transactions, complicate financing, and cast a shadow over ownership that lingers long after it is removed. And the fact that they were willing to prepare one without jurisdiction revealed just how far they were prepared to go. Standing on the land during this period felt different than before, not because the earth itself had changed, but because I could feel the weight of someone else's intention pressing against it, an invisible claim trying to manifest through paperwork and presence rather than right. The realization settled in that this conflict would not resolve through reason or documentation alone, because reason assumes a shared respect for boundaries, and documentation assumes a willingness to accept facts, and the HOA had demonstrated neither. They were testing whether authority could be created by momentum, whether acting as though something were true long enough would make it so, and whether resistance would eventually collapse under the sheer inconvenience of fighting back. As the chapter drew to a close, the situation had reached a point where ignoring the HOA was no longer possible and quietly responding was no longer effective, because they had crossed from asserting authority to exercising it, from claiming oversight to behaving as though ownership itself were negotiable, and that shift marked the moment when this dispute stopped being an administrative nuisance and became a full-scale attempt to take control of land through pressure, persistence, and the assumption that no one would push back hard enough to stop them, setting the stage for confrontation that would soon force the question of how much power an HOA actually has when someone refuses to let intimidation rewrite the law. The transition from threat to action did not announce itself with drama or urgency, and that was what made it so dangerous, because the HOA did not need raised voices or legal filings to change the reality on the ground. They simply needed to behave as though permission had already been granted and resistance no longer mattered. It began with small but unmistakable intrusions, a maintenance crew trimming along an access road that crossed the edge of my property, survey stakes reappearing after being removed, and warning tags attached to old structures that had stood untouched for decades, each act framed as routine upkeep, each one a quiet declaration that they believed the land was already under their authority. I received notices afterward, not before, documenting work that had supposedly been performed in accordance with community standards, as though the act itself retroactively justified the claim. And reading those notices felt like watching someone move furniture into a house they did not own and then hand you a receipt for the trouble. The most alarming development came when heavy equipment appeared near one of the boundary lines, machinery that had no legitimate reason to be there, accompanied by contractors wearing branded vests that identified them as working on behalf of the association, and that moment stripped away any remaining illusion that this was a clerical dispute, because once equipment arrives, intentions become physical and consequences immediate. I halted the activity, documented everything, and issued formal trespass notices. Yet the response from the HOA did not retreat or apologize. It reframed, claiming that their contractors had been authorized to perform preparatory assessments necessary for compliance planning, language vague enough to sound official while avoiding any direct admission of wrongdoing. This pattern repeated itself, action first, justification later, and each time it happened, the HOA acted less like an organization unsure of its authority and more like one daring me to stop them, pushing just far enough to see where resistance might finally give way. Around this time, communications from the HOA took on a new tone, one that blended impatience with condescension, implying that my refusal to cooperate was delaying community improvements, inconveniencing residents, and creating unnecessary conflict, as though my defense of legally owned land were a selfish obstacle rather than a reasonable boundary. That shift was strategic, because it reframed the narrative from property rights to community harmony, a move designed to isolate opposition by portraying it as disruptive rather than justified. I became aware that internal HOA discussions had begun referring to my land as a holdout, a term loaded with implication, suggesting that inclusion was inevitable and resistance merely temporary, and that language spread quickly among residents, shaping perception long before any legal determination could challenge it. The pressure was no longer just administrative, it was social, reputational, and psychological, and that multi-layered approach made it far more exhausting to counter, because it required vigilance on multiple fronts at once. The financial side escalated as well, with a formal notice stating that failure to resolve outstanding compliance issues would result in the filing of a lien within a fixed number of days, a deadline chosen not for legal necessity, but for maximum pressure, timed to coincide with unrelated personal obligations in my life, as though the HOA had calculated when resistance would be most inconvenient. The notice referenced internal policies, enforcement precedents, and board resolutions, none of which had any legal relevance to land outside their jurisdiction, yet they were presented as if they carried the weight of law, relying on the fact that many people cannot easily distinguish between authority asserted and authority granted. What made this stage particularly unsettling was the realization that the HOA seemed less concerned with whether they were right and more focused on whether they could proceed without being stopped, operating on the assumption that enforcement itself would create legitimacy, that once actions were taken and recorded, reversing them would be so burdensome that the outcome would favor whoever moved first. I found myself spending more time documenting and responding than enjoying the land, more energy countering claims than planning its future, and that imbalance was clearly part of their strategy, because conflict is often won not by strength, but by attrition. Despite this, the more aggressive they became, the clearer their overreach appeared, and that clarity brought a strange calm, because it removed any lingering doubt about their intentions, confirming that this was not a misunderstanding to be clarified, but an incursion to be resisted. I began preparing for the next phase, understanding that the HOA would not stop at partial measures, that the filing of a lien or some other formal encumbrance was coming, and that when it did, the conflict would shift into a more visible and consequential arena, one where evidence, procedure, and patience would matter more than intimidation. As this chapter closed, the land felt less like a quiet inheritance and more like a contested frontier, a place where paper authority was attempting to manifest through physical action, and the question was no longer whether the HOA would push further, but how far they would go before someone forced them to confront the limits of their power, a reckoning that was drawing closer with every unauthorized step they took, and every assumption they made that silence or exhaustion would eventually turn resistance into surrender. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with a lawsuit or a court order, but with a notice that carried a quiet finality, a document informing me that the HOA had officially recorded a lien against my property, an action taken without jurisdiction, without consent, and without any legal foundation beyond their own internal belief that authority could be claimed simply by acting as though it existed. Seeing that lien referenced in writing felt like a violation in the purest sense, because it was no longer just harassment or trespass. It was an attempt to alter the legal status of land that had never belonged to them, to insert themselves into the chain of ownership through force of paperwork rather than right. The notice framed the lien as a consequence of continued noncompliance, listing fabricated dues, penalties, and administrative fees that had been accumulated over years of supposed association membership that had never occurred. And the sheer audacity of it revealed how far the HOA was willing to go once challenged. This was not a bluff. It was a calculated move designed to create leverage, to complicate ownership, and to make the cost of fighting back feel heavier than the cost of giving in. And it marked the point where restraint on my part was no longer an option. I immediately verified the filing with county records, confirming that the lien had indeed been recorded, transforming a baseless claim into a tangible encumbrance that could affect financing, future transactions, and the perception of ownership itself. And that confirmation brought with it a surge of clarity, because once an organization crosses that line, the conflict becomes less about negotiation and more about accountability. The HOA communications following the filing were almost disturbingly calm, treating the lien as a routine enforcement step, encouraging resolution through compliance rather than acknowledging the severity of what they had done, as though placing a lien on 1,200 acres of land they did not control was a minor administrative detail, rather than serious legal overreach. That tone made it clear that they expected the lien to work, expected it to intimidate, to pressure, and ultimately to force submission, and the confidence behind that expectation suggested they had used this tactic successfully before. What they did not anticipate was the way this action reframed the entire situation, because up until that moment, the conflict had existed largely in the shadows of paperwork and correspondence. But a recorded lien is public, verifiable, and traceable, and once it exists, so does the evidence of who placed it and on what basis. I began assembling a comprehensive record, not just of my ownership, but of every step the HOA had taken to assert authority without right, every notice, every inspection attempt, every trespass, and now every filing, creating a timeline that showed escalation rather than enforcement, ambition rather than governance. This process revealed patterns that were impossible to ignore, repeated assertions of jurisdiction without proof, repeated actions taken before justification, and repeated reliance on the assumption that no one would push back hard enough to expose the overreach. The lien also changed how others perceived the conflict, because neighbors, lenders, and local officials could now see that something was wrong, that an HOA had stepped outside its bounds in a way that could not be dismissed as a clerical error. Inquiries began to surface, quiet at first, questions about how an association could place a lien on land that was never part of its development, and those questions mattered because they shifted the burden from me having to prove ownership to the HOA having to justify its actions. The stress of that period was real because liens carry consequences regardless of their validity, and living with one attached to your property means living with constant uncertainty. But that stress was paired with resolve because the HOA had finally given me something concrete to challenge, something that could not be brushed aside or minimized. I prepared formal demands for release, not as requests but as notices of wrongful filing, citing statutes, case law, and recorded evidence, making it clear that the lien was not merely disputed but unlawful, and that its removal was not optional. The response from the HOA was delayed, uncharacteristically so, and that delay spoke volumes because it suggested that even they understood at some level that they had overreached, that this was no longer a gray area to be pressured through persistence, but a clear violation that carried risk for them as well. When their reply finally arrived, it did not defend the lien on legal grounds, but attempted to justify it through process, arguing that internal determinations had been made and that disputes could be addressed through their established channels, a response that ignored the fundamental issue entirely because internal channels do not create authority where none exists. That disconnect revealed the core of their strategy, an insistence that procedure itself could substitute for jurisdiction, that acting in accordance with their rules made actions legitimate regardless of whether those rules applied, and that belief was now exposed as the foundation of everything they had done. As this chapter closed, the conflict had reached a point of no return, because the HOA had crossed a line that transformed intimidation into actionable harm, and in doing so, they had shifted the balance of the situation, unknowingly providing the very evidence needed to challenge not just the lien, but their entire claim to authority over land that was never theirs, setting the stage for a confrontation that would move beyond private pressure into a public reckoning, one where assumptions would be tested against law and overreach would be measured against consequence. The filing of lien acted like a signal flare, pulling the conflict out of private correspondence and into a space where it could no longer be quietly managed or conveniently ignored. Because once a claim is recorded publicly, it invites scrutiny, and scrutiny is something organizations built on assumption rarely welcome. Almost immediately, the atmosphere around the situation changed, not because the HOA softened its stance, but because others began to notice what had been done, and questions started circulating beyond my own mailbox. Local officials, title professionals, and even residents within the HOA-owned development began asking how an association could legally encumber land that had never been part of its governing documents, and those questions mattered because they disrupted the narrative of inevitability the HOA had worked so carefully to construct. I began formally notifying relevant parties of the dispute, not to escalate emotionally, but to ensure that the record reflected reality, that anyone encountering the lien understood it was contested, unsupported, and actively challenged. This was not retaliation. It was transparency, and transparency has a way of undermining intimidation by replacing fear with information. The HOA responded by doubling down on messaging, distributing updates that framed the situation as a routine compliance issue complicated by an uncooperative landowner, language designed to minimize their actions while isolating resistance, but that framing began to crack as people compared it against publicly available records that told a very different story. The more visible the conflict became, the harder it was for the HOA to rely on vague assertions and internal policies, because those tools work best in obscurity, where few people ask detailed questions and fewer still verify the answers. I noticed a shift in their communications, more careful wording, more disclaimers, and a sudden emphasis on seeking resolution, a term often used when an organization realizes it may need to retreat without admitting fault. Despite this softer language, their actions did not immediately change and the lien remained in place, a reminder that recognition of risk does not always lead to responsible behavior, especially when pride and precedent are involved. At the same time, the social pressure the HOA had attempted to apply began to reverse, as residents who had initially accepted the association's version of events started expressing concern about the implications of such overreach. Because if an HOA could place a lien on land outside its boundaries, then the security of everyone's property was potentially at risk. That realization mattered because it reframed the issue from a single dispute to a systemic problem, and systemic problems attract attention in ways individual grievances rarely do. I continued documenting everything, understanding that public attention can fade as quickly as it arrives, and that consistency matters more than outrage when challenging an entrenched organization. The cameras, logs, and correspondence became not just defensive tools, but a record of behavior that showed a clear pattern of escalation and disregard for jurisdiction, a pattern that would be difficult to explain away if examined closely. The HOA attempted to regain control of the narrative by scheduling meetings and offering mediation through channels they controlled, invitations framed as opportunities for dialogue but structured in ways that assumed their authority as a given, and declining those invitations was necessary, because engaging on their terms would legitimize the premise they were still trying to assert. That refusal was portrayed as stubbornness, but in reality, it was a refusal to accept a framework designed to produce a predetermined outcome. Behind the scenes, the tone within the HOA appeared to be changing, with reports of internal disagreement, questions about risk exposure, and concerns over potential liability, all signs that the certainty they had projected outward was not universally shared internally. The lien that had been intended as leverage was now a liability, a documented act that could not be undone quietly, and the longer it remained, the more attention it attracted. I became aware that the HOA legal counsel had been consulted more frequently, that communications slowed as messages were vetted, and that some enforcement actions unrelated to my land were paused, suggesting that the organization was reassessing its approach more broadly. This was not victory, but it was movement, a shift from aggressive expansion to cautious defense. And that shift mattered because it indicated that the strategy of persistence was beginning to falter under scrutiny. The emotional weight of this phase was heavy, because public disputes carry their own stress, and knowing that your property is being discussed, debated, and misrepresented in forums you do not control is exhausting. But it also brought a strange sense of validation, because the facts were finally being seen by more than just the two parties involved. As the chapter drew to a close, the conflict had evolved from a private battle over authority into a public question about the limits of HOA power, and that evolution changed the stakes for everyone involved, because now the outcome would not only determine the future of 1,200 acres of land, but also send a message about whether assumption and intimidation could truly substitute for law when exposed to daylight, setting the stage for a decisive phase where the HOA would have to choose between retreating quietly or defending an overreach that was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. As the attention surrounding the lien continued to spread, subtle fractures began appearing in what had once seemed like a unified and confident front, revealing that the HOA authority was not as solid internally as it had appeared externally. And those fractures mattered because organizations built on pressure rely heavily on the illusion of consensus. Communications from the association became increasingly inconsistent, with some messages insisting on unwavering enforcement, while others hinted at flexibility and review, a contradiction that suggested internal disagreement about how far this conflict should go. The certainty that had driven their earlier actions began to erode, replaced by cautious phrasing and delayed responses, as though every word now carried the risk of being used against them later. I noticed that enforcement notices slowed, inspections ceased entirely, and the physical presence that had once been so assertive faded into absence, leaving behind only the lien as a stubborn remnant of their overreach. That absence was telling because it indicated a recalculation rather than a retreat, a pause to reassess whether continued aggression would expose the organization to consequences it could no longer manage quietly. Behind that pause, however, pressure continued in less visible ways, through indirect messages and subtle suggestions that cooperation would make the problem go away faster, appeals framed as practical rather than authoritative, attempting to coax rather than compel, and that shift in tone revealed how much leverage they had lost once scrutiny entered the picture. The land itself remained unchanged, sprawling and indifferent to the conflict surrounding it, but my relationship with it had evolved, because defending it had become as much about protecting principle as preserving property, and that clarity helped counter the fatigue that inevitably accompanied prolonged disputes. Meanwhile, rumors began circulating among residents that the HOA leadership was divided, with some board members questioning the legality of the lien and others worried about the precedent of backing down, a tension that underscored the real risk of overreach, because once an organization commits publicly to a position, reversing course can feel like an admission of weakness, even when it is the responsible choice. Those internal debates slowed decision-making, creating gaps where uncertainty replaced momentum, and momentum had always been their greatest weapon. I continued to operate as though escalation was still possible, because organizations do not always abandon flawed strategies gracefully, and desperation can lead to reckless decisions, especially when authority is challenged. The documentation grew thicker, the timeline clearer, and the pattern undeniable, showing a steady progression from assumption to enforcement without jurisdiction. A story that could not easily be reframed as misunderstanding. At the same time, the HOA attempted to reassert relevance by raising unrelated community issues, trying to drown out the controversy with routine business. But that tactic only highlighted how disruptive this dispute had become, because ignoring a problem does not make it disappear when it is anchored in public record. The lien lingered like a fault line, visible evidence of a claim that no longer fit the narrative they were trying to maintain, and every day it remained unresolved increased the risk that someone outside the organization would decide to look more closely. That possibility weighed heavily, because external review often uncovers patterns rather than isolated incidents, and patterns can lead to consequences far beyond a single dispute. I sensed that the HOA was caught between two fears: the fear of admitting they had overstepped, and the fear of what would happen if they did not correct it. And that paralysis created space for reason to re-enter a conflict that had been driven almost entirely by momentum until then. Despite the quieter surface, the tension remained, because unresolved conflicts rarely dissolve on their own, and silence can be as strategic as noise. I resisted the urge to interpret the slowdown as victory, understanding that organizations under pressure sometimes wait for attention to fade before resuming their efforts, and that patience would be just as important as vigilance in the coming phase. As this chapter closed, the battle lines were no longer advancing, but they were still drawn, and the HOA facade of unquestioned authority showed visible cracks that suggested the next move would not come from confidence but from necessity, forcing a decision that would reveal whether they were willing to accept the limits of their power or risk exposing themselves further by continuing a claim that had already begun to collapse under its own weight. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a sudden reversal, but with a series of quiet, deliberate shifts that signaled the HOA was no longer advancing its claim, but searching for a way out that would preserve as much dignity as possible. The first sign was a change in how the lien itself was described in their communications, no longer presented as an enforcement tool, but as an administrative measure pending review. Language carefully chosen to soften its significance without acknowledging that it should never have existed in the first place. That reframing mattered because it indicated an awareness that the lien, once wielded as leverage, had become a liability that could not be defended indefinitely. Around the same time, I noticed that references to my land began disappearing from community updates, as though erasing mention could undo the controversy. A strategy that revealed how much the HOA relied on controlling narrative to maintain authority. The absence was noticeable precisely because the land had been referenced so confidently before, and its sudden omission spoke louder than any statement could have. Behind the scenes, communication became more indirect, routed through intermediaries rather than delivered as firm directives, suggesting that the organization was testing the waters for de-escalation without fully committing to it. I continue to insist on one point above all others, that any resolution must begin with acknowledgement of jurisdictional reality, because compromise without correction would leave the door open for future overreach, and that insistence shaped every response I made, ensuring the conflict remained anchored in facts rather than convenience. The HOA attempts to propose mutual understandings and boundary clarifications, without conceding error, revealed how difficult it is for institutions to admit fault, especially when their authority depends on the perception of infallibility. Despite that, progress was being made, not because the HOA suddenly embraced reason, but because the cost of maintaining the dispute was beginning to outweigh the benefit of winning it, a calculation driven by risk rather than principle. The longer the lien remained, the more it threatened to invite deeper examination, and deeper examination would likely uncover not just this incident, but others like it, a prospect no organization welcomes. The tone of correspondence softened further, shifting from obligation to cooperation, from deadlines to discussions, and that shift marked a psychological turning point, because it signaled that the HOA was no longer confident it could simply outlast resistance. I remained cautious, understanding that retreats can be temporary and that concessions without formal action mean little, but the trajectory was unmistakable, moving away from enforcement toward disengagement. The land, unchanged and silent throughout this ordeal, seemed to underscore the absurdity of the conflict, a reminder that the struggle had never been about stewardship or community, but about control exercised beyond its rightful scope. I became aware that the HOA had sought external advice, not for enforcement but for risk management, a telling move that suggested they were finally considering the consequences of their actions rather than the convenience of their assumptions. That advice appeared to be reshaping their approach, because communications grew slower, more deliberate, and less frequent, as though each step forward was now taken with caution rather than confidence. The lien, once central to their strategy, became an awkward subject they avoided addressing directly, a silence that confirmed how untenable it had become. As this chapter progressed, the balance of power shifted subtly but decisively, not through confrontation but through exposure, because when overreach is documented and made visible, it loses the mystique that allows it to function. The HOA authority, once asserted loudly, now felt conditional and fragile, dependent on avoiding further scrutiny rather than imposing compliance. As the chapter closed, it was clear that the conflict had reached a point where resolution was possible, not because the HOA had been convinced they were wrong, but because continuing to insist they were right had become too risky, setting the stage for a final phase in which their attempted takeover would either be formally undone or quietly abandoned, and the outcome would reveal whether accountability could truly prevail over assumption when the two collide. The unraveling of the HOA claim did not happen all at once, but through a slow sequence of retreats that, when viewed together, made it impossible to deny what was happening, because authority that must constantly redefine itself to survive eventually exposes its own weakness. The first concrete sign came when the HOA quietly stopped referencing any enforcement authority over my land in official correspondence, a subtle but meaningful shift that contrasted sharply with their earlier certainty, when every letter had assumed jurisdiction as a given. That silence was not accidental. It was calculated, an attempt to step back without leaving footprints, and yet the record already existed, and no amount of quiet omission could erase the months of documented overreach. The lien, still recorded, remained the central issue, because its existence contradicted the softer tone the HOA was now adopting, creating a tension they could not resolve without decisive action. Requests for clarification went unanswered longer than before, responses delayed as though each reply required multiple approvals, and that hesitation revealed how constrained their options had become. Internally, the organization appeared to be grappling with the consequences of its own momentum, realizing too late that asserting control without foundation had placed it in a position where any defense would only deepen exposure. Eventually, communication arrived that framed the lien as a procedural error, language carefully chosen to minimize responsibility while acknowledging enough fault to justify removal, and that phrasing mattered because it represented the first implicit admission that something had gone wrong. The explanation offered was vague, citing administrative oversight and boundary misunderstandings, but it did not challenge the underlying reality that the land was never within their jurisdiction, and that omission spoke volumes. The process of undoing the lien moved forward slowly, not because it was complex, but because the HOA needed time to manage perception, to ensure that the reversal did not appear to undermine their authority more broadly. During this period, I remained vigilant, understanding that partial retreats can sometimes be reversed if pressure fades, and that formal resolution matters far more than verbal assurances. The removal of the lien, when it finally occurred, was done without announcement or apology, recorded quietly as though it had always been temporary, a procedural footnote rather than a fundamental error, and that quietness was itself an admission, because organizations confident in their authority do not erase their actions silently. The public record now showed not just the lien but its removal, a traceable arc that raised as many questions as it answered, and that visibility ensured the incident would not disappear entirely, no matter how much the HOA wished it would. In the aftermath, the association ceased all attempts to assert authority over the land, inspections stopped permanently, correspondence ended, and even informal inquiries disappeared, as though the boundary they had once tried so hard to blur had suddenly become immovable. The land returned to silence, the unnatural tension lifted, and the absence of intrusion felt almost surreal after months of constant pressure. What remained was clarity, because the collapse of their claim demonstrated that authority asserted without foundation can persist for a time, but it cannot withstand sustained exposure. The HOA strategy had relied on assumption, intimidation, and the expectation that resistance would falter before accountability arrived. And when that expectation proved wrong, the entire structure of their claim fell apart. As this chapter closed, the conflict was no longer active, but its implications lingered, because what had happened was not just a personal victory, but a demonstration of how far such organizations can go when unchecked, and how quickly they retreat when their actions are forced into the open, setting the stage for reflection, resolution, and the final reckoning of what the attempted takeover had revealed about power, persistence, and the importance of refusing to let assumption rewrite reality. When the conflict finally ended, it did not feel like triumph in the way stories often promise, because there was no celebration, no apology, and no moment where the past months suddenly felt worthwhile. Only a quiet return to normalcy that carried with it a deeper understanding of how fragile property rights can become when confronted by persistent authority that is rarely questioned. The land was still there, unchanged and expansive, stretching across hills and tree lines exactly as it had before the HOA ever noticed it. And yet, my relationship with it had transformed, because it now represented not just inheritance, but endurance, a reminder that ownership is not merely documented but defended. The absence of intrusion felt almost unfamiliar at first. The silence where letters, notices, and unauthorized inspections had once filled the space, and that silence allowed reflection to settle in, revealing lessons that extended far beyond a single dispute. What the HOA attempted was not unique in spirit, even if its scale was unusual, because the core of the conflict was not land size but unchecked assumption, the belief that authority can expand simply by behaving as though it already has, and that belief thrives in environments where resistance is rare and fatigue is common. The experience exposed how systems designed for convenience can become tools of coercion when boundaries are blurred, and how easily procedural language can be used to mask actions that would otherwise be recognized as overreach. The lien, brief though its existence ultimately was, demonstrated how powerful paper can be when wielded without scrutiny, capable of disrupting lives and altering realities even when it is entirely illegitimate, and that realization was sobering because it showed how many people might comply not because they are wrong, but because fighting feels too costly. Looking back, the most important decision was not any single response or document, but the refusal to accept the premise that authority must be legitimate simply because it is confidently asserted. A refusal that required patience more than aggression, and consistency more than outrage. The HOA retreated not because it was convinced of fairness, but because exposure stripped away the comfort of operating without challenge, and that distinction matters, because it underscores the role of transparency in correcting imbalance, not as a moral force, but as a practical one. The land itself became a symbol of that lesson, 1,200 acres standing as quiet proof that boundaries still matter, that size does not determine vulnerability, and that even large institutions can miscalculate when they mistake persistence for legitimacy. In the end, the attempted takeover failed not through dramatic confrontation, but through sustained resistance anchored in documentation, clarity, and an unwillingness to let inconvenience dictate outcome. A process that was exhausting but effective precisely because it denied the HOA the easy victory it had expected. As time passed and the memory of the conflict began to fade, what remained was a renewed sense of responsibility, not just to the land, but to the idea that ownership carries with it the obligation to defend not only one's own rights, but the principles that protect everyone's property from similar overreach. The story of the 1,200 acres did not end with headlines or legal precedent, but with a quiet affirmation that authority, no matter how confidently asserted, is only as strong as the foundation beneath it, and that when that foundation is absent, even the most persistent pressure will eventually collapse, leaving behind nothing but records, lessons, and land that remains, as it always should have been, under the control of the person who truly owns it.